Could a skyscraper float if it were hollow? This question comes from a curious viewer who asks, what if you took a modern skyscraper, say one of those enormous glass and steel giants from New York or Dubai, and made it completely hollow inside? Could it actually float like a gigantic boat? Or would it just tip over and sink immediately, like a very expensive spoon dropped into soup? To start, let's be clear about what we mean. A skyscraper is normally designed to sit on the ground. Its structural supports are made for resisting gravity and wind, not for floating. But let's imagine a scenario where we build a hollow skyscraper, seal tight, and then drop it in the ocean. Could it act like a giant ship? The answer depends on one of the oldest and simplest principles of physics, Archimedes' principle. That's the one that says an object floats if it pushes aside or displaces a weight of water greater than its own weight. It's why steel ships can float even though a single chunk of steel would sink. Ships are mostly empty space, and it's the air inside that keeps them buoyant. So if you turn your skyscraper into a giant hollow tube, you're basically making the weirdest cruise ship in history. Let's run some numbers. A skyscraper like the Empire State Building weighs around 365,000 tons. That's a lot, but remember, 1 cubic meter of water weighs 1 metric ton. So to float, the skyscraper would need to displace 365,000 cubic meters of water. That's a cube about 70 meters on a side. By skyscraper standards, that's actually not so bad. A tall tower could displace much more than that if it were sealed up and pushed into the ocean. So the short answer is yes, in theory, a hollow skyscraper could float. In practice, though, we run into some problems. First-class skyscrapers aren't shaped like ships. They're tall and narrow, with very small bases compared to their height. Imagine balancing a pencil upright in a swimming pool. It doesn't matter if the pencil is hollow. It'll tip over instantly. Your floating skyscraper would do the same. Instead of standing proudly above the waves, it would keel over like a drunk giraffe and float sideways. The world's most expensive, most dangerous pool noodle, but maybe that's okay. Let's assume we embrace the sideways skyscraper. What would that look like? Picture a tower lying on its side across the ocean, with waves crashing over the upper floors and the tip of the spire sticking up like an antenna for passing seagulls. Inside, all the offices and elevators would be completely useless, but the building itself would bob along happily like a giant Lego brick. Now let's consider what happens when people inevitably try to live inside this floating skyscraper. First of all your hallways and staircases are rotated 90 degrees. Doors are now trapdoors, and desks are stacked in awkward piles against the walls. Elevators? Forget it. They're now the most claustrophobic aquariums you've ever seen. If anyone still insists on working here, the dress code will have to include helmets and life jackets. Of course, engineers are clever. They wouldn't just toss the building into the water as is. They'd add stabilizers, ballast tanks, maybe even a flat platform to keep it upright. But at some point, you realize you've stopped building a skyscraper and started building a ship. A very, very silly ship that just happens to look like a building someone dropped into the ocean by mistake. Still, the fantasy is worth exploring. What if we went further and made not just one floating skyscraper, but an entire floating city of towers? Imagine Manhattan, but instead of being anchored to an island, it's bobbing in the middle of the Atlantic. Ferries wouldn't be needed. You just jump between drifting towers like a video game character. The stock exchange would be canceled every time there was a storm surge, and Wall Street bankers would have to do their deals while sliding back and forth across boardrooms. For tourists, though, it would be spectacular, the world's tallest water park. But then the ocean itself might have something to say about this. Waves, storms, and currents are unforgiving. A skyscraper is designed to withstand strong winds, but not the constant pounding of waves dozens of meters tall. Over time, the structure would crack, leak, and eventually collapse into a spectacularly expensive artificial reef. Fish would move in, coral would grow. And in a few decades, divers would tell stories about the ghostly office chairs scattered across the seabed, the first underwater skyscraper museum. There's another interesting twist. If you built the skyscraper out of lightweight materials like carbon fiber, and if it were large enough, it might not only float, but actually rise high above the waves. It would look like an enormous vertical buoy. In that case, you could theoretically tether it to the seafloor and use it as a floating research station or even a luxury hotel. The Problem, of course, is that guests would constantly complain about seasickness. Checking into your hotel room on the 120th floor would feel like trying to sleep inside a rocking cradle the size of a mountain. And then there's the ultimate what if. Could a skyscraper float not on water, but in the air? After all, air is also a fluid, just much less dense. Balloons float in it, as do airships. If you made a skyscraper completely hollow and filled it with helium or hydrogen, could it rise into the sky like the world's largest blimp? Sadly, the numbers don't work out. Even with the most buoyant gases, you'd need a volume the size of a small mountain to lift something as heavy as a skyscraper. So while a tower might float on the ocean, it's not going to drift gently through the clouds anytime soon, which is probably for the best. A runaway floating skyscraper drifting over your city would be the sort of plot twist even disaster movies would find too silly. Still, the original question was simple. Could a hollow skyscraper float? The answer is yes, but not in the way you imagine. It wouldn't stand tall like an oceanic lighthouse. It would flop over like a soggy breadstick and bob around until engineers gave up and called it a failed experiment. It would be impractical, uncomfortable, and dangerous, but it would also be strangely beautiful. A steel and glass whale gliding across the sea, defying its original purpose and quietly reinventing itself as the world's strangest boat. And if Hollywood ever gets hold of this idea, it won't end quietly. Instead, there will be a movie trailer that begins with a dramatic voiceover. In a world where cities no longer stand, they float. Cut to skyscrapers drifting through hurricanes, villains using skyscraper fleets as mobile fortresses, and heroes leaping between the rooftops of bobbing towers. There would definitely be explosions, possibly sharks, almost certainly Vin Diesel. And by the end, the only lesson anyone takes away is the same one we just reached. Yes, a skyscraper could float, but you'd be crazy to try it.